welcome back to my basement. Very recently, the new Texas Chainsaw Massacre film got released, and my first thought while I was watching the trailer for the film was that this was an awful entry in a great franchise. And then I realized that I've never seen any of the other Texas Chainsaw Massacre films besides the first one. So I thought I would take a look at all the Texas Chainsaw Massacre films to celebrate the release of this newest one, and see, are the sequels really that awful? Before I get into actually watching these films, I thought I would take a look at the franchise. And while doing that, I realized just how strange this franchise is. The first sequel is a direct sequel to the original, but it's also a parody of the original. The third and fourth movies are both sequels that seem to practically ignore the other sequels in the franchise and not really link into the first one in any real way besides having Leatherface in them. And the actual remake from 2003 has a prequel, which is not to be confused with the 2017 film, which is also a prequel, but this time to the original film. And this 2017 prequel is called Leatherface, and takes place within the universe of the 2013 film, Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3D. Don't confuse the 2017 Leatherface prequel with the third film from 1990 called Leatherface, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3. After the success of the first Texas Chainsaw Massacre film in 1974, many would assume that a sequel that simply rehashed ideas from the original would be churned out as fast as possible. However, this was far from the case. The second film came out a full 12 years after the original, and did actually use ideas from the first film, but not in the way you would think. This movie is not a realistic grindhouse slasher film, instead it's a parody of the original film. There were a couple of gags that are good in theory, like Chop Top or Horny Leatherface, but they just feel painful to watch in the film due to how overplayed they are. That's what it does with all of these scenes in the movie. It overplays and drags them out to degrees that work to the film's detriment. I think it's funny that Lefty is chainsaw crazy and just saws the whole layer down bit by bit, but that's all he does for an hour. The scene with Grandpa was great in the first film and very disturbing, but this film just makes it so silly, takes up so much runtime, that it sours my experience with the original. There are a few funny jokes, but by a few I mean like 3. The movie also takes all the worst parts from the first, like the bad acting and the drawn-out chase scenes, and just makes them even more painful. The last hour of the film is literally just one big chase scene. The ending is also very lackluster, and the last shot left a bad taste in my mouth. I would give this one a 4 out of 10. The film received mostly negative reviews from critics upon its release, but the movie did gross $8 million on a $4 million budget, which still made a profit, but not enough of a profit to even closely match huge success of the first film, which made $30 million in box office earnings on a much smaller budget. However, this movie has since gone on to garner a cult status, with many people thinking it is just as good as the original. But it would again take another 6 years for another film in the franchise to be released, and this next film would come to fruition after New Line Cinema purchased the rights to the franchise, hoping to expand the repertoire of horror franchises. Shooting for the new film took place in late 1989, and the movie was released in 1990. In my opinion, this movie sucks. It tries to recreate the magic of the first film without understanding the fundamentals of why it was magical in the first place. The movie looks much higher budget than the first, but this really works to its detriment, because now it's so much blander and more boring than ever before. The film is mostly just characters running around dark woods for 40 minutes. You can barely see what's going on because of how dark it is. Not that you really need to see what's happening because it's so boring. For a movie called Leatherface, there's barely any Leatherface action in it. The extent of Leatherface's actions in the movie are just him spookily running around and chasing people. When we finally get to the family's house, it isn't even scary. It loses all the disturbing charm of the original and feels like it's a Goosebumps episode.
You are beware. You're in for a scare. Goosebumps.
Grandpa is no longer a gross old man. Now he's a literal corpse they feed blood to sustain his life force or something dumb like that. There's also a creepy little girl that adds nothing to the film. The ending is even worse, as it turns into a bad 80s action film with guns, floodlights, car chases, and cool rock music. Overall, it's a jumbled mess of a film that can't even figure out
what it wants to be. I would probably give this one like, I don't know, like 2 out of 10.
Well, the film was a bomb at the box office and was also critically panned. But the next film in the franchise was written by Kim Hinkle, who helped co-write the screenplay for the first film. His main intention while making this film was to bring the franchise back to its roots, and it was shot on the lowest budget yet since the first film, one of only $600,000. Even with this low budget, it still featured performances from Renee Zellweger and Matthew McConaughey, even though these were their first big roles, so, they weren't famous yet. But the film was originally distributed by Columbia Pictures in 1995 for a very small theatrical run, but was later cut down and re-released in 1997, capitalized on the now ginormous careers of 2 of the actors in the film, and only grossed $185,000, which makes it the worst performing film in the whole franchise, even to date.
This is the best sequel so far. Due to how utterly incompetent it is. Everything in this movie is so poorly thought out, it's a mess from start to finish, and it's not quite sure what it wants to be. Sometimes it wants us to take it seriously, and sometimes it wants to be a goofy parody like the second film, and other times it tries to be a not-so-subtle allegory for the Illuminati. However, the absolute insanity of this film makes for an engaging experience that constantly has you guessing what crazy stuff they're gonna do next. The movie starts out with 4 teens, but they all get killed off pretty quickly. After the first 20 minutes or so, they're pretty much forgotten about. That's when it changes from a standard slasher like the third film into a goofy parody like the second. There is stuff like the prosthetic leg that is weird on purpose, and other stuff like how Leatherface's costume is terribly put together and the terrible acting that are bad on accident.
You better not shoot me, mister.
It really leaves you second guessing how self-aware the film really is. The drive-through scene and most of the chase scenes at the start of the film are very strange and unimportant to the plot. This is what I thought most of the movie was going to be, random stuff that forms no semblance of plot. However, the movie then decides that this family is not a group of cannibals like the last films. No. This movie retcons the rest of the franchise by saying that all of the families in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre franchise are different families that are just connected through way of an Illuminati-like conspiracy that uses its power to create horror movie-like scenarios to have victims experience a spiritual-like state. Apparently, the family in this one is doing a bad job, and that's why the Illuminati actually show up towards the end of the film to apologize. That allows us to view the film through a completely different lens of this being bad on purpose, but somehow they are still so tone-deaf that they managed to make a movie that doesn't realize how nonsensical it truly is. I'll give this one like a 5 out of 10 due to the fact that it's both my favorite sequel and the most poorly made one.
After the failure of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, The Next Generation, the franchise took a bit of a break. That was until 2001, when Michael Bay acquired the rights to make a remake of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Well, he didn't, but his company, Platinum's Dunes, did. Soon after, the screenplay was written and Marcus Nispel was chosen to direct the film in his directorial debut. The film started shooting in 2002 on a budget of $9.5 million. It was released on the 17th of October 2003 and went on to gross $100 million, becoming the highest grossing entry of the franchise yet, even outperforming the original film.
This movie really wants to pretend it's just as realistic and disturbing as the original film. It tries to make it seem as 70s as possible, but in its attempt to make a serious horror movie, it makes something that came off try-hard. The movie tries to craft a plot that feels too convoluted and too confusing to work, instead of sticking with the original simple plot about a group of teens that end up too close to a house of cannibals. This movie starts with the hitchhiker committing suicide, and the plot gets set into motion by them trying to give the body to the police. It has a bunch of weird tropes like bad sound effects, the evil sheriff, creepy kids, etc., and the twists are just so predictable. It tries to trick you by doing what the first film did, introducing a trustworthy character who ends up evil. The only problem is that they make them come off creepy and weird, so it isn't much of a shock. All of the characters are written so poorly, and there is no motivation for anything they do. You try to get invested, but the film just takes itself way too seriously that you get bored. The worst part is that the reason the family kidnaps people is because Leatherface was bullied as a kid. Yes, they literally add a backstory to Leatherface, the epitome of an unknown evil character. The reason the first film was so scary and creepy is because we didn't know what his deal was. But this film ruins that. It ruins everything. I would give it like a 30 out of 10, but even that seems too generous. Even though the movie was well liked by audiences, critics hated it.
The worst movie of the year, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre was a big hit, which means that people actually spent their own money in order to waste 2 hours of their lives looking at this complete garbage.
This didn't deter Platinum Dunes from greenlighting a prequel to the movie, which was released in 2006.
In my humble opinion, the prequel is the worst entry yet. It's not even a prequel in the traditional sense. Rather than showing Leatherface becoming who he is, or the reason why the Sawyer family, or the Hewitt family now, are cannibals, no, instead the film takes place only 4 years before the first film for some reason, which is kind of weird for a prequel, and it shows us stuff we didn't really even care about. Oh, how did the sheriff become the evil sheriff? What? How did he do that? I don't know. How did the guy in the wheelchair in the house get his legs cut off? I don't know. We should maybe make a movie explaining all of that. Which isn't really a good idea, because the whole point of all that stuff is, man, this is weird. This is a creepy town. This is like an unknown. And the whole point of the film, you don't know what's going on. And when you destroy all that by being like, this is exactly what's going on. Let me lay it out for you. It's dumb. It's stupid. Like, and you don't even do anything original with it. It's literally the same film again. You made the same movie a second time. Horny young adults going through Texas, and they have to stop in the town, and then, oh no, they're evil now. But now everything that might be mysterious about the evilness of this town is ruined, because guess what? Now we know exactly why they're evil. And the worst part is that there's barely even any Leatherface in this. Since this takes place before they actually started planning out how these murders are gonna work, before Leatherface became a big part of this, chasing people around with a chainsaw. Now he's just like sits in his basement and he whines and cries all day, and then he cuts people's faces off sometimes. Like, he doesn't even do his main Leatherface thing. It's called the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. There's like 2 scenes with a chainsaw. I'm like a 1 out of 10. This one's worse. Way worse.
The film still managed to make $51 million on a $16 million budget somehow. The movie still faced harsh criticism and ended up even being nominated for a Razzie Award. It must have not been a big enough success for Mr. Michael Bay, though, because the franchise was shelved after the release of the film. That is, until 2009, when Lionsgate and Twisted Pictures got together to purchase the rights to the franchise. In 2011, a new film was officially greenlit, and a director and writer were chosen for this film. In 2013, the movie was released to reviews panning the film, with it currently sitting at a 19% on Rotten Tomatoes. Personally, I think the film was bad, but not entirely awful. The reason why I say that is because unlike the remake duology, this movie is not boring in the slightest. Sure, it does not reach the insane heights of the 4th film, but it still has some very funny moments. The terrible acting is funny.
Do your thing, cuz.
The plot holes, the twist reveals, the film's insistence on the loud and obnoxious sound effects, the bad 3D, and all the funny moments like when Leatherface throws a chainsaw, or how Heather becomes best friends with the man who killed all of her friends at the beginning of the film. The movie is still really poorly put together in every aspect, don't get me wrong. Hell, it barely even tries to keep itself in line with the continuity of the film that it is apparently a direct sequel to, but all these things are what makes it at least a little bit enjoyable.
After the success of Texas Chainsaw 3D, Millennium Films started work on a sequel called Texas Chainsaw 4. Texas Chainsaw 4, you know the 3D and 3D stood for 3 dimensions, right? Like, and it's not even the 3rd film in this continuity. It's the 2nd film in this continuity. It's a direct sequel to the 1st one. So the title makes no sense. It doesn't matter because the film never got made. Instead, production got started on a prequel film entitled Leatherface about Leatherface in his teenage years. Screenwriter and producer Seth M. Sherwood decided that a prequel would be best, as to not further destroy the terrible continuity of the series, which I agree with. Sherwood wrote the film, and on May 10th of 2015, principal photography began. The movie was set for release in 2016, but was shelved by Lionsgate, despite its completion. It didn't actually get a premiere until August 2017, and it was eventually just released on DirecTV On Demand, the satellite service, in September of that year, which was followed by a limited theatrical run in October.
In my opinion, this movie is probably the most original film in the whole series. It's a coming-of-age story about Leatherface himself and his relationships with his friends and family. It's a very interesting concept that the film doesn't really use to its advantage, though. The movie is filled to the brim with dumb 2010s horror cliches, but more in a way where the film just feels standard, rather than laughably bad. The movie definitely has its funny moments, like all the weird necrophilia stuff or the poorly delivered dialogue.
I love Texas.
But it's also full of a bunch of lame and boring stuff. All the CGI really sucks, and the story about the cop getting revenge is rather unremarkable and pretty dumb. I like the new take on Leatherface not having autism or some similar mental disorder, but it really tries to trick you into thinking that Bud, who acts like how we expect Leatherface to, is actually Leatherface. It doesn't really do this for any reason outside of just a cheap fake out that makes us go, whoa! What? Sort of sits between laughably bad and boring for me. I would probably give it like a 3 out of 10. But before Leatherface, the producers had the right to make 6 more films. Due to how long it took for the film to actually get a release, they lost the rights to the franchise, and in 2018, Legendary Pictures purchased the rights to the franchise. Work on another film installment began in 2019, and in February of 2020, 2 directors were added to the project. By August, filming on the project had begun.
Finally, that brings us to today, February 18th, 2022. The movie, entitled Texas Chainsaw Massacre, was released directly to Netflix. The film itself was originally touted as a direct sequel to the first film. However, more recently, a producer on the film said that the events of the original 3 sequels actually happened within the continuity of this film.
Okay, so when I was making the video, I didn't actually have the proper context for the quote, but now I do. So let's read this quote, which is from bloodydisgusting.com, by the way, and these quotes were taken for the Boo Crew episode 200. She took him under her wing, probably. I think a lot of the movies that happened after the original still happened. He probably escaped. He was in and out of that place for a long time. I think she probably gave him enough chances as movies happen, and then it got to a point that he settled down, he just stayed there. So he refers to Leatherface, and she refers to his motherly figure in the new film, which he does clear up in this article that she isn't supposed to be his actual mother. She's just a good lady who looks over him, which is good to clear up, I guess, because that makes more sense continuity-wise with the first film. And if this was a direct sequel to the first film, that would actually make a lot of sense. But he tries to say that a lot of the movies that happened after the original still happened, which makes less sense.
It actually doesn't matter. Because I can safely say, while watching this movie, that continuity doesn't matter. Doesn't make sense. And that's okay. None of these movies care about continuity. Instead of being a boring slasher, this movie tries to be smart. Or not tries to be, it pretends to be. It puts on a layer of smartness. It's a masquerade. It tries to comment on gentrification, trauma, the general wokeness of today's society, and several other half-baked concepts. It doesn't even do any of this in a particularly subtle way. It actually spits in your face for most of the movie, being like, look, we're cool, look how cool we are. You know, the school shooting victim looks at pictures of guns on her phone, and we just see her look at pictures of guns, and she's like, that's a gun. She practically flashes her bullet wound at the camera, like, look at my collarbone, it has a bullet wound on it. That's what she does in the movie. Not to any of the characters, just randomly to the camera for no reason. And a bunch of kids forcefully evict an elderly woman from her home to kind of comment on, I guess, gentrification, because the whole plot of this movie is a bunch of younger woke kids go to an old country town and they try to refurbish it and turn it into a new woke town or something weird like that. It doesn't really matter, because this movie is not smart at all. It pretends like it's trying to say something, but it just isn't. The movie uses these concepts to hide the fact it's just a dumb horror movie, where stupid things happen for the sake of progressing the story. And speaking of Sally, her conclusion has nothing. Nada. Zip. It has nothing. She's just there to imitate the success of Halloween 2018, but in Halloween 2018, Laurie's character made sense for her to have trauma. She locks herself away in her home in order to not have to deal with her trauma associated with Halloween night, you know? It makes sense. This movie, Sally just goes after, she just goes after Leatherface. And for no reason. It's just because, we want to get Sally back, so we're just gonna have her just run after Leatherface for no reason and chase him down to kill him. You know, this would be cool, I guess, even though it doesn't make sense with Sally's character. But again, continuity isn't one of these films' strong suit. So, it would make sense. Except she doesn't kill Leatherface. She just like stands there with the gun, like, "Oh, I'm gonna kill you." This movie doesn't try anything. It has stupid dialogue. Characters make stupid decisions, and none of it is smart. The writing in this movie is idiotic. It's stupid. The only thing that I think this film gets a little bit right is the kills. The kills are visually way better than any of the other recent sequels because they don't actually use a lot of CGI, which I think is a cool thing that a lot of newer horror movies are doing. They're using practical effects in conjunction with CGI to actually, you know, make something that looks good instead of just using CGI as more of a gimmick, or because it's like cheaper but easier, I guess. But this movie actually does a good job with the kills. And they're visually more entertaining and way better than all the different sequels. And I do actually think the ending is good in theory. I like the sister dynamic of these two characters. It's a good idea. I know it's not a brand new idea, but it's better than just like the normal final girl dynamic. And that's one of the only things that the movie could actually do well in terms of a story. Until one of the sisters get killed off at the very end, like right before the movie ends, she dies. And it's like, oh no, what happened? She died! And like, was I supposed to be like shocked by that? That just made me angry. You ruined the only good thing this movie had going for it besides, you know, the visually interesting kills. But yeah, this movie stinks. It sucks. And I would try to rank all these movies, which I'll leave a link in the description to a letterbox list ranking all these films, but in this video, I don't think I need to, because ranking these films are all pointless, because they all suck, to varying degrees, but they all suck. There's only one good movie in this franchise, and that is the first one. Don't try to watch these movies. You're gonna end up disappointed and sad and tired, and I'm happy that this is over. But honestly, I think Tobe Hooper had it right with his first sequel. Not the biggest fan of that movie, but I at least appreciate it and respect it for realizing it's impossible to make a good Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie by just doing the same thing again, or trying to do the same thing again. Without the unapologetic realism of the first film, you have a generic slasher with nothing going for it. And that's also something the remake didn't understand. You can't just make the original on a bigger budget and add like a couple more like, here's some more lore for you, you know? Because the original movie is really simple, and if you try to add more stuff to this really simple concept, you're just going to overload it and make it dumb and not work at all. That's why all these movies suck. They don't understand what made the first movie good, or they just don't care to understand what made the first movie good. A lot of these movies don't even try. So yeah, don't try this at home, please. That's all I have for you today. Goodbye.